Welcome. So we are in our last week of the computational neuroscience course, and in the previous two lectures we have covered some of the theoretical principles based on sparse coding or efficient coding as to how we can see what receptive fields are optimal in a way that there is minimal energy usage and the representation of the stimuli are also adequate in terms of responses of neurons. So following this, we will be discussing a few more theoretical aspects along with modeling aspect along the same lines again, that is maximizing mutual information or information transfer and with minimal energy, that is representing our stimuli with minimal energy. And with those ideas, in one case we will show how a neural system develops in a particular way, and in another case we will see how on theoretical basis we can come up with spike timing dependent plasticity kind of rules. So let us go to our examples that we have done so far with long-term plasticity and long-term depression, short-term plasticity, both of them together. We will consider one example. This is from one of our own work, and so if you recollect, we had said that there are a set of neurons called subplate neurons in the cortex, in the cortical region, which are the first-born neurons, and they are transient in nature. They are first-born neurons in the cortex, and they are transient in nature in the sense that they die after a certain period of time, and their existence is coincident with what we know as critical period. So in one of our work, we show that in the auditory system, from earlier work, what you already know is that during critical period, if this is the primary auditory cortex surface in the cortical regions, let us say this is A1, we know that it is arranged tonotopically from low frequencies to high frequencies with medium frequencies in between. So there is a gradual gradation. So that is what we call as tonotopy. We also said that if during critical period we expose an animal with presentation of one particular frequency that is represented normally, let us say over this hatched region, let us say this is 7 kilohertz, and let us say this is a rat A1, and it is presented with 7 kilohertz pips of tones, simple pure tone continuously, like every half a second or so. Then when the so this is the let us say animal during at birth, then it goes through a critical period when that 7 kilohertz is presented, and then when the animal is an adult, the auditory cortex is mapped, and this is the primary auditory cortex, and compared to the the 7 kilohertz region gets expanded. So this is the low frequency and high frequency, and at the cost of representation of the nearby frequencies which are taken over by this 7 kilohertz region. And if this 7 kilohertz presentation is done after critical period, then that does not lead to such plastic changes. So the idea that was pursued by us was that actually at an earlier period, which showed that the subplate neurons are actually responsive to sound, and maybe not the layer 4 neuron. So, if you recollect the circuitry, we have a thalamic input going into the subplate neurons, and its collateral goes onto the input layer, layer 4 of the cortex, and subplate then projects onto layer 4, and this, after completion of the thalamocortical development, ends up being a synapse on layer 4 of a certain weight. And remember that this is a very minimal representation of the circuitry. We had also mentioned to you that the actual circuitry has subplate to layer 4 convergent inputs, and similarly from thalamus to subplate convergent inputs, and thalamus to layer 4 convergent inputs as well. So, this is layer 4, this is subplate, and this is thalamus, where this axis is the frequency axis or the tonotopic axis, and many neurons, many subplate neurons in along the frequency axis project onto layer 4, and many thalamic neurons along the frequency axis project onto subplate neurons as well as layer 4 neurons, and a similar kind of arrangement, plastic development of the thalamocortical circuitry can be seen. There are further complications here with inhibitory neurons playing another role, plus there are feedback from layer 4 to subplate and subplate to thalamus. So, things are not as simple as we represent here, but the principles that we will talk about are going to be similar. So, considering this circuitry, this simple circuitry which transforms into simply thalamus to layer 4, in that scenario, what is found is that if we have layer 4 neurons, if we record from subplate neurons, these subplate neurons tend to be deviant selective, that is, they are deviant detectors, whereas layer 4 neurons are not. At ages even before what is considered as critical period. So, in other words, what is found is in the auditory cortex, if you record from subplate neurons at ages of P10, that is 10-day-old mice, or P9, 9-day-old mice, this is before critical period, which is believed to be P12 to P16 for the 7 kilohertz experiment that we talked about. It is this period when the 7 kilohertz presentation works to have an over representation of 7 kilohertz. So, preceding that period in P9, P10, P11, in those regions, even P8, what is found is that the subplate neurons are deviant selective in the sense that if you play a standard frequency tone, as we have discussed earlier, and a deviant tone at a low probability, it is found that the subplate neurons are hardly responding to the standard, but they respond to the deviant token with a larger response rate, much larger response rate, and there is hardly any response to the standard. So, that is, maybe initially when you present the standard, there is a blip response in the very onset, but beyond that it is simply adapted to the standard sound and there are no responses whatsoever to the standard, and it only responds to the deviant, or at least that is what most of the data says. So, in other words, if in these ages, if we do the 7 kilohertz experiment, that is at P9 to 10, P9 to P10 or P11 before critical period. So, let us say this is critical period. Before this, if you do the 7 kilohertz presentation as discussed, then based on these data that we are talking about, standard, there is no response, then the subplate neurons are not at all driven by this 7 kilohertz continuously presented tone. And so, there is no effect of a continuous presentation of the 7 kilohertz in terms of plasticity in the adult. So, it is then likely that the experiments that suggested that presentation of 7 kilohertz at critical period leads to expansion of 7 kilohertz, and presentation of 7 kilohertz after P12 to 16 doesn't do anything. Similarly, the presentation of 7 kilohertz continuously before critical period also doesn't do anything, and so that critical period window came up to be P12 to 16. It's the experiment that with standard and deviant, where the deviant, let us say, is now 7 kilohertz and the standard presentation is, let's say, 4 kilohertz or 17 kilohertz. So, in that case, we have an experiment where it appears that something that is being presented at a much lower probability, that is actually driving the system, and the standard sound is not able to drive the system. So, in this case, what is observed is that before this critical period, if we do a standard deviant presentation, then later on, and as an adult, we find that the responses to the deviant sound is altered. That is, the responses to the deviant sound is increased in the adult compared to a typically developing animal which is not exposed to any different protocol during its development. So, if the deviant is 7 kilohertz, then there is a strengthening of the synapses that drive 7 kilohertz in the layer 4 region. So, the idea here is that the same thing, that if we now consider that there are two inputs onto the subplate and layer 4 and consider competition between the two. So, let us say this is the standard and this is the deviant frequency that is presented. Then the standard is unable to drive the layer 4 neuron, and so this synapse weakens, and the deviant frequency 7 kilohertz, in this case the deviant, this synapse strengthens. So, as opposed to a normally developing one where there is equal presentation of S and D gradually, or in fact just regular development where you have some activity in both standard and deviant, unlike a continuous activity in standard with minimal activity at periodically in deviants. Compared to that case scenario, this synapse gets much stronger, which is what is observed in the adult. So, here there are two things in the modeling at play. One is the modeling of the short term plasticity, which is at the synapses that you know how to implement, and there is long term plasticity also in the same synapses, which lead to the strengthening or weakening of the standard and deviant synapses. So, if you want to implement this whole idea, you can actually actually do it in a network also and show this phenomena happening, that the deviant representation becomes stronger and stronger in the adult, with again with leaky integrate and fire subplate neuron and layer 4 neuron, and synapses that have the 3-state model implementing the short term plasticity, and if we have Hebbian spike timing dependent plasticity at the synapses. So, this is an example of where we implement both kinds of plasticity simultaneously in the same circuitry. So, where is the theoretical aspect of this whole idea? By the way, so these are supported further by control experiments with standard deviant presentation in the critical period and only standard presentation in the pre-critical period, and so on. So, coming to the theoretical aspect of this whole idea, what what is addressed, what was addressed is that why is it that the deviant representation should increase. Why is it that this deviant representation should strengthen? So, this problem can be formulated in this manner, that you have a neural system and there are responses of the output, let us say the layer 4 neuron, that has responses to standard and responses to the deviant. And in the input, what we have is presentation of standard and presentation of deviant with different probabilities, that is, let us say this is 10% and this is 90%, or more generally this is p and this is 1 minus p. So, starting with very similar values of Rs and Rd in before the plasticity takes place, the idea was to optimize mutual information and firing rate. So, in the same way, from the input, if this is x, to the output this is y, which takes on values of r, Rs and Rd. There are two kind of mean responses to the two stimuli, and x is the input with the two stimuli s and d with probabilities as given 1 minus p and p. There is a mutual information between I, x and y, the input and output, where y is the rate response and x is the stimulus identity with associated with different probabilities, and the rate response also has different probabilities. And there is a total amount of spiking activity, that is Rs plus Rd in a weighted manner, that is p times Rs, 1 minus p times Rs and p times Rd. This is the total rate, where Rs and Rd are the mean rates in response to S and D during development. So, these are variable. So, and so of course, we need a normalization factor between the two. We can put in a lambda, and so we want minimal amount of rate and maximum amount of mutual information with a monotonic change in Rs and Rd. So, and with a minus sign, we want to minimize this and maximize this. This overall term needs to be maximized, and with algebra finally you can show that it indeed, if we want to maximize the mutual information under certain constraints, we will find that Rd has to strengthen much faster than Rs. In fact, Rs has to keep on going down to a point where the mutual information is increasing, whereas the rate overall summed activity is reducing. So, this simple the simple explanation, the intuitive explanation is that, well, in order to maximize the mutual information between x and y, we need to have larger and larger separation between Rs and Rd. So, obviously, if we need to maximize this with minimal amount of activity, Rs has to be less than Rd. It is because Rs is weighted way more times than Rd. So, it is a very, very simple intuitive explanation, although it requires a lot of algebra because of the framing of the problem. So, I hope that here you appreciate the overall points that have been covered, and that is, let us say, so in this case we have implementation of long-term plasticity and short-term plasticity, both of them simultaneously. We have so far been talking of them separately. Secondly, we have an example which appears counterintuitive in the sense that we always talk of learning and plasticity as something that is repeated multiple times in association with something else. That association is the longer lasting one, that is the one that gets potentiated. However, counterintuitively here we actually have something that is low probability, that is occurring much more rarely or very less frequently. That particular sounds or that particular stimulus's representation is getting strengthened. So the low probability event is potentiated. Thirdly, we have a theoretical way of looking at the same problem and showing that actually with mutual information maximization and minimal activity, we can actually show this counterintuitive kind of plastic development in the cortex. So, with this particular example and the theoretical way of dealing with these problems, we will be ending our lecture for this section, and in the next section we will be talking about another example of deriving rules of plasticity, particularly certain spike timing dependent plasticity rules based on completely theoretical aspects. Thank you.